Hi everybody, Keith Tanner here from Flyin Miata, and today I'm going to talk about fettling. I think it's a more British word, but basically the process of taking a good car and making it into a very good car. And basically it's based on what I like to do and what I think should be done when you get yourself a new used car. Because most of us are not buying new 1990 Miatas anymore. Most of us are not buying new 2016 Miatas anymore. They're all used now. So what happens when a new used car comes into your life? What should you do? Now, this isn't a buyer's guide. I'm not going to sit here and talk about how to inspect the car before you buy it, to look for rust, to look for this, to look for that kind of thing. I'm assuming that you found a car that's at a price point you like, that's at a level of completeness that you like. It's got all the engines you prefer, that sort of thing. And you just, how can you take this and make it basically as good as it can be? What should you look at to make sure that this car stays reliable and becomes a really nice place to spend time? And as you might recall, if you've been watching this channel, you know that Mike just picked up a new NC, Jeremy just picked up, Jeremy just picked up a new NA. This little 1990 has come into my life recently, or has actually been in there for a while, so I've been working on it. So consider this a recap of what a lot of influencers would build a great big build series out. What should you look at when you bring in this car? You want to make sure that it's solid. And what have I done to this one? I'll use that as a sort of guide as to how I turned this from a pretty decent little driver into what's turned into a very, very nice little car. So there's four basic areas I'm going to talk about here. One is suspension. One is the mechanical side of things, powertrain mostly. The interior and cleaning. It seems ridiculous, and as anyone who knows me knows, I am not the guy who polishes his car with a diaper every Sunday afternoon, but I am going to talk about what the effect is or why you might want to do that for your new used Miata. So I'm going to start out with the suspension, because it was the first thing on my list. So on the suspension, you're going to want to check. This makes a big difference on a car, especially a Miata. You can make a bigger difference for the dollar on suspension than just about anywhere else on the car. This includes power mods, but also in terms of drivability and how comfortable, how enjoyable it is to drive. And a lot of this is just paying attention. Pay attention to any leaks, any leaking shocks. Obviously, that's a bad sign. Any clunks, any rattles, any noises, squeaks. You should attend to those. Take a look, find out what they are, because they're an indication of something not working right. Let me get my notes here so I sound like I know what I'm talking about. There we go. So, the first and easiest thing to do, and honestly you should do this on any Miata, whether it's the brand new off the lot or whatever, is get it aligned. Because it's amazing. First off, factory alignments are just ish. And then if you take it to Pep Boys or something to get aligned, they'll just slap it in there and get it within the wide range that it shows on the specifications on their computer. And maybe you did that 15 years ago and you've hit a few potholes ever since, or something got changed and get adjusted. So even if you don't do anything else, just getting it aligned can have a big effect on steering feel, on stability, on handling. It's a relatively inexpensive modification, and it'll help your tires live longer, for example. So that's a good first thing to do. And the nice thing is, when those alignments are being done, the shops will often take a look over the suspension and let you know, say, hey, by the way, you've got some blown boots on your tie rod ends. You might want to take care of those. That's a second person to take an eyeball over the suspension and let you know. So that's the first thing. You want to do alignment. You'll want to pay attention to the tires. Obviously, if you're buying a used Miata, chances are a lot of them sit for a long time before they get sold. Just the nature of these little cars. They get put aside for a while, and then you pick it up and it's your new project. You're going to want to take a look at the tires. Even if they look great, they might have an old date code. I'm still waiting for my new Michelins to show up, but these tires, they look fine. They're an all-season. They're a Uniroyal. Nothing terrible. There are worse tires on the road, but their date code is something like 2008. So obviously, these are well past their expiry date. They haven't seen a lot of UV because this car came from Canada, stored in the wintertime, hasn't seen a lot of abuse, but that's an older tire than I'm willing to accept. And you can tell, if you're tuned into these things, the tires are not helping the ride quality because the sidewalls have sort of become, you almost want to call it brittle. They're stiff, but not in a performance way. And so they're detracting from the ride quality in the car. So a new set of rubber will help this thing quite a bit. And I also, when I've been going through various things on the car, I also discovered a blown shock, and that helped quite a bit, getting that shock replaced under warranty. I was able to do that because I was the original purchaser of the shocks 28 years ago or whatever it was, 23, getting stuff like that sorted out. For the brakes, I strongly recommend that you, of course, do a full brake service, whether it's just greasing all the slider pins, especially on the rears. That can make an enormous difference to brake feel. It gives you a chance to check to see what the pads look like. If you have a sticking slider pin, you get a chance to see this. This is all the sort of thing that's difficult to evaluate before you buy the car, but it's something you should do after you bring it home. Is just go through the whole braking system, bleed it all or flush it all, get new fluid in there, adjust everything so that it feels good, make sure that the rear brakes are adjusted properly, make sure that the sliders are all there. I mean, it's all just little maintenance stuff, but it's the sort of thing you have to do as part of getting to know the car. Now, another thing you can do, and this goes a long way, this is a little more involved than simply going through and getting it aligned, checking the brakes and that sort of thing. Suspension bushings. I replaced the suspension bushings on this car, which has about 130,000 miles on it. And I replaced the suspension bushings after it had been in my care for a little while, and the difference was spectacular. I've just got factory rubber bushings in this thing. I didn't go with poly or Delrin or anything exotic. It's basically just got a refresh to factory spec. And the difference in apparent rigidity on the chassis is enormous. It's a lot of work. There's 22 of these things. They all need to be pushed out, pushed back in. I think we're doing a bushing swap video right now, actually, so you'll see that on our channel soon. But it's one of those things where putting a few $100s into a new set of bushings can have an enormous effect on the way the car feels. Obviously, if you're going to do an alignment, wait until you're done with the bushing change, because you're going to take everything apart anyway. And the nice thing about that is it also gives you a chance to check everything. So it's a fairly high effort thing to do, and not everyone, of course, is going to do it. But definitely, if the car feels old, if it feels just a little rattly, a little bit loose, that's a great way to make an enormous difference. Mike, do we have any questions yet? Okay. So that's most of what we have going on with suspension. Basically, just go through everything, but those are the easy ones. Get the alignment done, it's well worth the money, and strongly consider doing bushings, especially on an older car, an NA and NB. Even the NCs by this point, NCs have a lot of bushings in their suspension, and they're all, I mean, what the newest NC is, I guess they're only about 8 years old now, but they are 8 years old. And the oldest ones are what, 17? So yeah, I mean, they're getting, we don't think of them as old cars, but they're getting up there a little bit. One of the other things I did on this car is I also changed out the bump stops, because it still had the original factory bump stops, which are fairly big, heavy rubber things. And so I swapped those out because I could feel in the back I was bottoming up more than I wanted to. And that is actually a wear item on a lot of cars, is the bump stops. They're cheap. They're a little bit of work to replace, but not that much work. But they can make a really big difference, again, to ride quality. And ride quality, I mean, if you're being cool and you say, I just want a race car for the street, good ride quality means that your tires are also staying in contact with the pavement. And you're more likely to want to drive the car, because you're not going to have to take that little bit of abuse. I've been through that, so I know what it's like having a race car on the street. You don't need to suffer. It's okay. No one's going to judge you for having a car that people actually want to spend time in. So yeah, that's what I did on this car, is basically what I just described. So now we talk about mechanical. Now mechanical is more a matter of investigating to make sure you don't have anything coming that's going to surprise you, and also making sure that it's going to be reliable. You don't want this car broken down the side of the road because you forgot to check something. The most obvious thing to do is to work your way through the engine bay. If you don't have proof that maintenance was done, assume it wasn't. So timing belt is the obvious one, but also when you're doing the timing belt, check all of the coolant hoses, for example. All of the hoses, make sure they're not crunchy, make sure they're still pliable. On NA Miatas, you especially want to look at the radiator. If it's got that green upper housing on it, that's a time bomb. It's not leaking yet. It will, and when it does, it might be catastrophic, and not necessarily where you want it to happen. So this is sort of preventative maintenance, but because you don't know the history of the car, you want to make sure that you sort of start the clock over again. You start with a known good situation. In this particular case, I did a timing belt on it. I did a transmission, differential, fluid change. Basically all the fluids got done, just to make sure I knew where we were. It was probably done at the mileage settings, but it had been a long time. This particular car had sat for several years, had very low usage for several years before I got it. So I just sort of went through everything and brought it up to spec. One thing to know about timing belts is that Mazda doesn't actually give a year range for changing it. They say 60,000 miles, but they do not say or 5 years, or 10 years, or 15 years, or whatever. So technically, if you've picked up a Miata that's got under 60,000 miles on it, I mean, NA and B, NCs, they've got chains, so don't worry about it. But if you've picked up an early Miata that doesn't have enough mileage to have reached the time belt changeover, it's still a good idea to do it because it is rubber. It does degrade over time, but Mazda does not give an actual time frame for that. So I've looked for it for years, but it's not there. And I also recommend that you chase down any weird little drivability things. This car, for example, when I got it, had a high idle when it was hot. You could drive around, it meant that it idled higher than it should have, but that led me down a series of troubleshooting steps that found two bad components. There was a coolant line that was completely clogged up, that was not allowing the IAC to register basically the change in temperature, and also the air valve, which is unique to a 1.6, was not working properly and was leaking. So changing out those two took this thing from being just a little annoyance in the background when you're driving it, you pull up to a stoplight and it's idling at 1200 RPM, to getting the standard rock solid 850 RPM idle that you expect out of what is basically, a healthy 1.6 Miata. So ignoring those things, that coolant clog problem would have continued to exhibit more and more problems as time went on, especially if chunks of it had come out and got stuck somewhere else in the motor. The air valve thing was just basically annoying. But the end result is, again, it's a car you get in, you jump in, you turn the key, and it wakes up and it just kind of purrs instead of having some odd behavior. I will tell you that chasing down that high idle was quite the exercise in troubleshooting. It came down to ambient temperature being a key in finding out what it was. I drove it when it was below freezing, and the change in behavior told me finally where to look. Any questions yet? Nope. Also, especially in a car that hasn't been sitting for a while, pay attention to things like the fuel injectors. Pulling the fuel injectors off and sending them off to a place like RC Engineering or someplace like that to get them cleaned could have a big effect on drivability and fuel economy, if that's important to you. But it can have a big effect on how the car feels. So changing out all your filters, of course, but also getting the injectors cleaned on a car that's been sitting for a while has a big difference. And again, it's not something you're going to notice on a test drive necessarily. It's not something you're going to notice when you're looking through the classified ads in Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or wherever it is you choose to buy your cars. But it's the sort of thing that can make the difference between a car that works pretty well towards a car that just purrs like it's supposed to from the factory. And that's something I've done with this car. I did get all the injectors cleaned as well because, again, even though I picked it up in Ottawa and I drove it all the way across from Ottawa, Canada to Colorado in 2 days, it was obviously very capable of that. This is a car that could easily be jumped in and driven for thousands of miles without a mechanical problem. It still had a lot of little niggling things that have made a big difference between a car that was, cute to look at, okay to drive, to a car that's actually a very pleasant car to drive because it feels like a new car. Okay. Now the actual mechanical things you want to look at is going to vary depending on the generation. I mean, obviously, if you're looking at any Miata except for a 1.6, that air valve is not going to be a problem because it's just simply not there. If you're looking at NCs, if you're looking at NDs, most of them aren't old enough to have mechanical woes yet, but time will come. All of them basically just go through and do their major services if they haven't been done. That's the biggest thing there. So the interior. Now, this is where you spend pretty much all your time in the car. Is you're inside, you're in the interior, you're looking at the dashboard, you're looking at the interior, you're touching the seats, you're touching the gear shift, you're touching the steering wheel. Pay some attention to this stuff. Fix any overt flaws, because you're spending a lot of time in there, you're looking at it all the time. You don't want it reminding you that this car is an old car, this car is a crunchy car. And yes, this one looks a little different inside because it's a Canadian car. We went over that in the last video, but spend a little bit of time on cleaning up the interior, fixing little problems, and it'll actually be much more pleasant. Even something like a steering wheel that's not all ratty, because the leather wheel cars, the leather has a tendency to come apart. I mean, on these ones too, if they get bad enough, the foam starts coming off the inside. Changing that makes a big difference because that's your tactile contact with the car. So pay some attention to that stuff, and it's amazing how much better it can make everything feel. And also, chase down rattles, because nothing makes a car feel old like rattles. On this car, it's got a hardtop on it now. One of the things I did was I had to rebuild all the latches on the hardtop. I had to adjust the hardtop mounting points on here. I found loose bolts. The Frankenstein bolts were loose. They're impossible to get off if you want to get them off, but these ones were loose. I made sure all the various connections, all the screws on the latches were tight. I serviced the soft top latches, which were in terrible shape. We have a video on how to do that, by the way, if you look on our channel. And the interior went from being a place where there was just little rattles from the top, rattles from here, squeaks from the top, and now it's completely silent because of just a little bit of work, a few bucks in parts, not a whole lot. but just enough to make everything tight back the way it should have been from the factory. And again, it's got a huge, even on a race car, it's got a huge psychological effect. So, strongly recommend it. So the last one I had on the list was clean it. And again, I said, this is not my usual thing. But cleaning the car is a way to really go over everything and learn it. You get a little more of its history if you didn't know. You know, I happen to know this car was repainted back here because there's a little bit of damage to the clear coat. When I was polishing it up, this car got a lot of cleaning because of the nature of its paint. It got polished and we had all sorts of tools going on. My garage looked like a crime scene, but that was just time. I mean, to spend some time polishing it. And even little things such as I found when I washed it that this particular section of the fender was sandblasted. They often are. A little bit of black paint, you know, piece of some masking tape, black paint, and all of a sudden the car looks so much better because of that. And that's the sort of thing you come across as you're cleaning it. And you can also, as you're cleaning, you discover things like, I discovered on this one of the headlight covers wasn't sitting quite right. Tracing that down, I found a problem with some wiring that wasn't routed correctly. Fixed that. Eventually that would have caused a problem with the headlights because it probably would have eventually damaged that wiring. And by doing the cleaning and adjusting those headlights to fit, I was able to chase that down and prevent future problems, which is what we're after here. Another little goofy one that I like. The 1.6 Miatas came with this sticker. You can't get these stickers from Mazda anymore. When you repaint the nose, no one ever puts them back on. But you can get them from Etsy, that sort of thing. I think Spinny Whoosh sells them. I cut this one on our vinyl printer, but putting that back on made it look like a proper 1.6 Miata again. That made me happy. Stupid little stuff. True, but that's the sort of thing that helps you bond with these and helps it feel more like a good car instead of just a used car. And that's what we're looking to do. Mike, do you have any questions? No questions whatsoever. Wow. So yeah, the last thing I did on this car when for the exteriors I give it the whole polish, and that helped me find a whole bunch of just little tiny stuff that needed adjusting, needed tweaking, gets rid of rattles, prevents, you know, I've got the proper little support bars in here. They're bolted in, so this is nice and tight instead of flopping around. Little stuff like that. I will show you the last thing I got. That's this wasn't on the car when I did the last video, but I'm very proud of it. We'll let the Miata nerds discuss this one. But I got it. I've never bought a custom license plate for another car, but I had to for this one because it makes me laugh. So there you go. We'll let the nerds feast on that one. And as you can see here, I know about this because I cleaned the car. I'll probably do something to reinforce that to keep it from cracking any further because we know that's a weak point. And I know that in the future, I'll probably have to change this out, but better than having it fly off when I'm driving down the interstate and all of a sudden there's a big hole in the back of my car. Nope, that's not cool. So there you go. There's my thoughts on how to take your new-to-you Miata and try to make it into something that's better than average. Try to make it into a car that you're really proud of, that really is better than it was for the previous owner, which is what we're after here. If you have any extra thoughts on that one, any questions, please throw them in the comments. We'll answer them in the comments in the future because obviously it's too late for me to answer them live. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please do subscribe to our channel. We do car walk-arounds, we do drives, we do technical downloads, we do installation videos, all sorts of great stuff. The Flyin Miata channel on Facebook and YouTube and Instagram and Twitter and whatever. So thanks for your attention. My name's Keith Tanner. We'll see you again soon.